you guys want to open your Bibles to Matthew 7, we're going to read some verses there first, after a few comments. So I'm recycling a lesson. It's pretty much exactly 7 years ago that I preached this lesson at InTown. It was in our second month of existence. But it doesn't originate with me. This is actually a lesson that Russ LeGrone preached in February of 2010. I may have talked to some of you about over the past years. But it was one of those lessons where, like, when you hear it, for years, like, you remember where you were sitting, you remember where you were facing, you kind of remember all the setting around you just because it made an impact on you, right? My boss calls these significant emotional events. He uses them. He creates significant emotional events for his workers sometimes to get them to change. But it was one of those things where, like, okay, I can still, right now, I can envision exactly what pew I was sitting on at Embry Hills. Like, I know what side I was sitting on. I know how far away from Russ. I know what he looked like. Like, it was one of those kind of sermons. If you've been at Embry Hills this year, he preached it again this year. Because I kept bugging him. Like, every February I would come around. I was like, hey, Russ, it's been this many years. You know, have you preached that lesson again yet? And he's like, no, I haven't done it. And then in 2020, it was 10 years. And then somebody told me just a couple months ago he preached it again up there. So you might have already heard it. This might be your second or third time hearing it. I don't know. But it's about a very specific sin. It's not kind of a generic lesson, meaning like high level. It's a very specific sin, and it's a dangerous one. If you look in Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 21, this is a passage we've read many times. We know this passage. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So we have to square ourselves with this idea that there are going to be people in the judgment who believe that they are saved, and they are not. And we always think of the other, right? It's not me. I believe I'm saved, but I really am. Well, what's the difference, right? Now, let me be clear. These people that Jesus is talking about here, I believe, are self-deceived. There's no mandate anywhere that someone who believes just can't know, right? But I think that's why this sin is particularly dangerous, is this sin can lead to this attitude where you're standing in judgment in false confidence, but fully confident that you're saved. And he looks at you and says, I don't know who you are. I never knew you. Another thing about this particular sin that's kind of interesting is conflict in a person's life and stress in a person's life can really, like, manifest. This sin just shows up. Like, it can't even be hidden. It's very obvious. And yet the person can't see it. The person with suffering, I'm going to say suffering from this sin, right? They can't see it, even though everyone around can. The sin is self-centeredness. And this is where everybody's kind of like all disappointed. Oh, self-centeredness. Like, everybody's self-centered. Yeah. Why are we talking about self-centeredness? Why aren't we talking about adultery or something serious? Right? Well, so we're going to get into some of those details, but let's think about what self-centeredness is first. It's being self-absorbed, and even that word is just, it's used as like a disparaging remark, but no one really thinks about what it means. Right? They just think, oh, it's obvious, right? You're one of those kinds of people, but it's not obvious. Self-centeredness is really, I mean, you can almost make it seem kind of innocent. It's just you're the center. This doesn't seem so bad. I mean, shouldn't I be the center? Like, I mean, when I wake up, I got to feed myself. That's me. You know? But it's also seeing the world and seeing those people around you in the light of how my life is affected by you. That's self-centeredness. It sounds very innocent. It's like, well, of course that's how I see it. You know, you hit my car, so I see the world as how you just impacted me. Right? Well, I mean, actually, you can be self-centered in a car accident, right? It's more about your car than it is about their safety or whether they got hurt, right? You see? So it basically boils down to, even if you're not thinking about it maliciously, what is most important to me? And it's not the same thing as being selfish. This isn't the same thing. There are self-centered people who will give away lots of clothes and lots of things just because they're of no use to them anymore. And then there are self-centered people who just are not focused on material things at all. I mean, they can live very minimalistic lives. It's just, that's not important to them. But you see why they give things away? It's about them not wanting it anymore. Self-centeredness is not selfishness. Selfishness is like, whatever you have that brings joy to you must bring joy to me, so I want to get it from you and have it for myself. That's selfish, right? Self-centered is, well, the thing you have might not be, but how can I use you in my life to benefit me? And in any way that you cause a burden to me, we need to get around that. You're not supposed to cause a burden to me. You're supposed to benefit me. So this is the time where we usually start looking around and like thinking, oh man, I'm glad he's here to hear this. Or I'm really sad she's not here to hear this. Well, not today. Not today. Today you're going to be asking, is that me? Because I'm going to force you to. I'm going to repeat it. So you have to. Let's look at, in Matthew as well. Matthew chapter 26, so several chapters later. I want to point this out to give more weight to why we should consider this. Matthew 26, beginning in verse 21. As they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." Being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, "Surely not I, Lord." That seems like a good response, but it's also self-centered. The first response isn't, "How can I protect you from that, Lord?" The first response is, "Surely it's not me. It can't be me. I know me. I wouldn't do that." Only one person betrayed him, but they were all self-centered. Look in Luke, verse 22. Chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. Luke is the only one who claims to have written this stuff down chronologically, or even to made an effort to make it chronological, right? So I usually take Luke as being pretty chronological. Even though in his own words he says he was just making an effort to do that, okay? Well, look in Luke 22, verse 14. We have the institution of the Lord's Supper, right? And now look in Luke 22, verse 24. There arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be greatest. Well, okay, so if the apostles are sitting in the presence of Jesus in the moment he institutes the Lord's Supper, on the night before he's going to be nailed to a cross, and they can be having this argument about which of them is regarded as the greatest, well, then this is a sin we need to spend some time thinking about. If the apostles who were with Jesus for 3 years can be self-centered on his last night, well, then we can fall into the same trap. So we need to ask today, is it I? Not surely, right? Not this kind of like, oh, I know it can't be me. But we need to ask really. Like, am I really the center of my world? We need to ask that. Okay, so let's talk about 3 reasons that this sin is so dangerous. One, I've mentioned already, is deceptive in nature. You don't have to turn back to Matthew 7. We just read it. But think again about Matthew 7, verse 21 to 23. Where is that located? It's at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, right? It's the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, what kinds of things were said in the Sermon on the Mount? Somebody slaps you, turn your other cheek. That was said in the Sermon on the Mount. If somebody takes your tunic, stop them and give them your cloak. That was said in the Sermon on the Mount. If anyone would force you to go 1 mile, keep going the second. Don't ask, would you like a second mile? You just go. You go the second mile. Not because they asked you for 1 mile, but because they forced you. They forced you to go 1 mile. And you give a second mile voluntarily. That was said in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, how on earth does a self-centered person do any of that? It would never happen. It would never happen. Right? And we're not talking about malicious people. We're not talking about someone who's like, oh, I hate the world. And, we're just talking about somebody who's just self-centered. Right? It's not like they're evil people or you hate to be around them or anything. It's just they're self-centered. So somebody slaps them on the cheek. Well, their response is, I need to right this wrong. I've been wronged. Right? Well, okay, let's think about that event in a completely non-self-centered way, right? Imagine someone who's completely emptied themselves of everything, and they get slapped on the cheek. Their first response might be something like this: wow, that person is so upset that they would be willing to strike me. What is going on in their life right now? What have they seen in me that, like, they didn't just yell at me, they actually struck me in the face? What is going on in their head? How could that happen to them to cause this, right? And so you turn the other cheek. And you say, you know what? Here's the other cheek. Let's see if there's still enough in you that you need another cheek. Right? I don't read the Sermon on the Mount from that perspective, people. I always read the Sermon on the Mount from the perspective of, okay, give me a test that I'm supposed to pass this test, right? Somebody slaps me, and so I got to pass. You see how self-centered it is? It's a test of me so that I've got to pass it, and then I can be the good Christian, or I can be the elite Christian because I turned the other cheek. I'm even reading the Sermon on the Mount as a self-centered person. It's not about me. It's about the person who struck me. Why did that happen? You see? This sin is very deceptive. I mean, I don't want to say it's impossible to self-diagnose, but I can't comprehend. I didn't self-diagnose it. I cannot comprehend how you would self-diagnose this. I can't tell you how many times I read the Sermon on the Mount. I never saw that in myself. What qualities, again, thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, we're not going to go read it. We don't have time. But what qualities did Jesus teach? Poor in spirit, meek, merciful, peacemakers, right? Not just being peaceable or being peaceful, but making peace where there's war. Right? You step in between 2 warring parties and you're going to get injured. Pure in heart. All of these things are opposite of someone who lives with themselves as the center of their universe. Why would I make peace between people? They're not at war with me. Live and let live. I mean, we can come up with all kinds of catchphrases we want to make excuses for ourselves. Self-centeredness is deceptive, and it puts you completely at odds, not with just the Sermon on the Mount, but with Jesus' character, with Scripture. So, is that you? Are you self-centered? Okay, the second reason that this sin is so dangerous is that it's an affront to God. All sin's an affront to God, okay? I get it. But this is like particularly, I think, and I guess Russ also thought, particularly insulting. Look in Romans, I'll just read Romans 8, verse 29. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined for what? To be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Okay? That was his plan. That's why we were created. Everybody wants to know why God created man. There you go. He wanted man to be conformed to the image of Jesus. Okay? Well, what is the image of Jesus? This is where I want you to turn. Philippians 2, even though everyone knows this. Another passage we all know. It's amazing how all these passages we know, but like when you see them in light of self-centeredness, they become new. Philippians 2, beginning in verse 5. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Okay, there's the attitude, right? Romans 8, God created us so that we would be conformed to the image of Jesus. There's the image that we're supposed to be conformed to. And I didn't read them, but in Philippians 2, verses 2 and 3, Paul makes it a command. Like, so we read in Romans the intent. God had this intent. Well, that should be enough. But if it's not, Philippians 2 says this is the command. This must be your mind. Well, okay, if you're a self-centered person, right, like I'm still struggling with, do you call yourself a Christian? I do. So imagine how insulting that would be to walk around saying I'm a Christian, but I'm not taking on the mind of Christ. Yeah, I want the name because if I didn't have the name, people would be harassing me. Like my family would be on my back. Hey, why aren't you a Christian? Well, okay, in the States it's easy to be a Christian. I take issue with that, but we'll just say that. Well, imagine God from his perspective. All of these people walking around saying, I'm a child of God. None of them having the mind or even attempting to adopt the mind of Christ, who emptied himself as God. It's an affront to him. So if we're serious about being called a Christian, like if we're serious about wearing his name, or his title, I guess. We're not a Jesus and we're a Christian, right? That's his title. He's the Christ. Well, then this passage in Philippians 2, it's not like this is some ideal. Like this has to describe you. I mean, you can't give up God. I'm not saying like you have to go through what Jesus did. You can't do that. But this mind has to describe your mind. It's not like, well, I respect that attitude. And I'm really glad Jesus had it. Paul didn't say respect it. Paul said, this is your mind. Or it better be. It needs to be. But self-centeredness, right, says, I'm number one. Why would I empty myself for anything? but we never like attack, or we're not malicious toward God or Jesus or maybe even other Christians. It's just, it's the mindset is so contrary to the attitude of Jesus that it's an insult. Well, is that you? Have you adopted this mind in Philippians 2 where other people, like everyone, really is more important than you? And like, at the drop of a hat, you can empty yourself and like, oh, yeah, absolutely, I'm the one. I can do this. I can help. My day doesn't matter. My plans don't matter. Right? Okay, third reason this is serious is it's destructive in nature. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I think this is obvious. It destroys our relationship with God. Like, we set ourselves against God when we remain self-centered, because he's not, and his son is not. But where I am going to get into a little more detail is it destroys our relationship with other Christians. Look in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 7 and 8. Again, I think everyone knows this. This is talked about quite a lot. Not always the way Paul talked about it. Usually when we're trying to find excuses not to do what it says. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 7 and 8. He's talking about Christians taking each other to court. In verse 7, he says, actually, then this is already a defeat for you, that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? On the contrary, you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brethren. Again, this is one of those things where there's just no way a self-centered person could do this. Like, have another Christian do something against the law, right? Breaking the law against me. Not only am I right in Scripture, you broke God's law because you disobeyed civil authority, right? But you also disobeyed civil authority. And I can wield that civil authority to make things right. How on earth is a self-centered person not going to do that? It's impossible. But that's what Paul is teaching here. And the God preserved for 2,000 years for us to read it today. You should prefer, according to what this is, you should prefer that you would be defrauded than you would take a brother to court. It should actually be a preference to you, not a burden. This brother broke the law against me, and I prefer, I so abhor taking him to court that I prefer suffering the wrong and having no justice. Well, if we're self-centered, that will never happen. Now, the person who did it was probably self-centered, right? But there's no, there's no command to be just as good as the brethren around you. We live like that. At least I do. I don't ever live as good as Jesus lived. I live, arrogance makes me try to live better, right? Well, I'm better. Self-centeredness destroys relationships with other Christians. I would maintain that this attitude Paul's describing here is something we need to have in all of our relationships, right? That we're just willing to be wronged if someone is going to wrong us, because it's what's reflected in the Sermon on the Mount. Someone stealing your cloak. So this is a whole other sermon in itself, but just a nugget to throw out there. Our friendships and relationships in life aren't or shouldn't just be formed solely for the benefit that we get from them. Why do you have the friends you have? Are you ever a friend to somebody who just needs to be a friend, even though they drive you up the wall? Man, that person drives me up the wall. But you know what? They drive everyone up the wall, so that means they need a friend. So I actually want to be a friend to them. And that's different than saying, I just want the people around me who feed me. Okay. It's particularly destructive to marriages. I leave this in here because Russ had it in here, and it was very important to him, and we have married people here. So I can't speak from any experience on this. I'm not speaking as some kind of marital authority. But I think you can obviously see how this would be a problem. In Ephesians 5, which William mentioned last week, the definition of marriage is defined by sacrifice. Like the husband sacrifices himself, like his being. The wife sacrifices her will, right, in submission. The definition of marriage is sacrifice. How can you be self-centered in that kind of relationship? If there are problems in your marriage, you have to ask yourself this is the question, is it me? Because you will always find faults in other people because they're there to be found. There is no perfect person walking on this earth. So when you live with someone 24/7 for years, you find faults in the other person. You have to. But if there's a problem in the marriage, you need to ask, is that me? Right? Because just because someone has faults doesn't mean that's the problem in the marriage. Again, what Russ says in his experience is when there are problems in the marriage, always one or both are completely self-centered. One or both. There's never two selfless people that are having problems in their marriage. I mean, marital problems in their marriage, right? They might have problems from the world. But as we mentioned earlier, we can't see our own faults, especially when we're self-centered. I'm not a bad person. The fault lies with my spouse. And it makes forgiveness like impossible. I use that word loosely. Okay, it's not impossible. But from a human perspective, it becomes impossible. When you are absolutely convinced that you are only helping your marriage and your spouse is only hurting your marriage, how are you going to forgive? Well, they're going to have to just roll over and, play obeisance to you and stroke your ego or whatever arrogance you have so that you can finally forgive them. Well, Jesus taught in Matthew 6 that if we don't forgive, we won't be forgiven. And if you can't even forgive your spouse, why would God want to forgive you? We're supposed to forgive everyone. You see? So instead of this focus on this person has hurt me or this person has made my life more difficult, the focus should be how have I eased my spouse's burdens? What are my spouse's burdens? What did I do yesterday to make his or her life easier? What am I going to do tomorrow? You see, when the focus shifts from self to other, you don't have time. to worry about the wrongs that you've suffered. You don't have, you will run out of energy serving other people if you do it right. And you won't have the energy to worry about yourself. Okay, there was a section in here about parents and kids. Sorry, guys. I'm going to skip it for time. Listen to Russ's sermon. It's very good. It's actually not talking about the kids' attitude toward the parents, but the parents toward the kids, and how the parents can become self-centered as the kids grow older. That you can say, hey, you know what? Now it's time for us. I thought it was a very good part of the sermon, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to move on to the conclusion. How do we diagnose this? Again, let's turn back to Matthew chapter 25. We're not going to read it, but again, this is a passage that's very familiar to us, Matthew 25, beginning in verse 31. It's the scene in judgment when everyone is gathered before the judge. And Jesus says, I had no food, I had no drink, I had no clothes, I had no comfort. And you didn't do anything. And the people standing there protested and said, I never saw you like that. If I'd seen you like that, I would have done something. And Jesus said, you didn't do it to my brethren, so you didn't do it to me. Well, this is just one way to diagnose, right? And in fact, Jesus didn't say that. I left a word out. The least of these. That's the key. Like you have in your head a list, a ranking. Everybody's got it. Oh, this is reliable brother. This is brother who I can call at any time. And then this is brother that is always calling me. This is brother I can't call. This is brother I can't rely on. And so we're just going to say that's least. Or you've got another ranking. You know what? This brother I just can't be around. I can't have conversations. Our minds are so different, right? And this brother, like we're on the same page about everything. Whatever your ranking is for least, Jesus admits that we do this. Whoever you consider to be least, what have you done for them? I think sometimes this is couched in terms of what have you done for your brethren. That's not how Jesus couches it. What have you done for the person who's least on your list, the bottom of your list? What have you done? Do you even know if they're hungry? At least these people saw it, and Jesus says, oh, well, you saw it. Right? Are we even finding out? Jesus says you should have responded. So one way to diagnose, self-centeredness is just to see how you spend your time. Who are you concerned about? Who's on your mind? Who are you praying about? Who are you calling? You need to think more clearly. We need to think more clearly about those who are around us. Find their needs and fill their needs. And when you see it, ask yourself, why am I not filling that need? I see this need right now. And be honest with yourself. Why am I not filling this need? Because I'm not. What's stopping me? Are you afraid of getting wrapped up in someone's problems? Right? Oh, man, their life is such a mess. Are you afraid it's going to cost you? Like, materially? Time? I mean, you can write down all your excuses, but I can tell you what they're going to look like. There's going to be a list of me and then a list of them. It's just going to be obvious. So, the apostles were given a second chance to correct this sin. Jesus washed their feet in the midst of all that mess on the night when they're arguing about who's greatest. And he washes Judas's feet. He washed all their feet. I hope that's not what it takes for us to change, because Jesus isn't going to walk in that door and wash your feet. Like, if that's what it's going to take for you to change, you've got a problem. The apostles were granted that blessing. But we have the revealed word. We can see that that's Jesus' attitude. So my suggestion is that we need to think more about his crucifixion and what he could have done instead of that and didn't do when he was being crucified. And instead he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. In the midst of being murdered, his gut reaction was the well-being of the people around him. We are not there. I'm not there, but we can cultivate that. And we can get closer. So that in times of crisis like that, our first gut reaction is going to be for someone else's good. And then maybe we can actually live out the Sermon on the Mount. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was helpful. I do recommend you guys hearing it done properly, going to the Embry Hills website and looking for Russ's sermon, February 2010. But now we're going to have a final song, and then I'll come up with a few comments, and Ryan is going to close us in a prayer after that.